No matter who you ask, the Islamic Republic of Iran is perceived to be one of the main enemies of the West. Governments in Europe and the United States change, but Tehran remains the central part of the axis of evil. So how has it managed to resist democracy for so long? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Our main story tonight focuses on the political future of Iran. Although the country has been an Islamic theocracy continuously since 1979, the time may have come for it to begin a new chapter in its history. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 85 years old. His health is declining, and soon he will have to appoint a successor. And that might not be easy given the rather scarce pool of suitable candidates. Internationally, Iran is facing a period of even greater uncertainty. The second Trump administration promises to go after the Ayatollahs with full force, and Tehran's proxies in the Middle East are being decimated. And at the same time, the country is strengthening its ties with autocracies all over the world. So where is this leading the Islamic Republic? We try to answer that question in our first report.
Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the overthrow of the monarchy, Iran has only had two supreme leaders. The founding father of the republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, died in 1989. He was succeeded by Ali Khamenei, who has held the post ever since. His election came as a surprise at the time, as he wasn't seen as a frontrunner by the top-level clergy in Iran. What tipped the scales, apparently, was Khamenei's decision to handpick the next supreme leader. Now, the Islamic Republic is on the verge of another succession, and tensions are beginning to emerge. According to the Iranian constitution, a special body known as the Assembly of Experts is tasked with selecting a replacement for Khamenei. The current assembly was elected this year and will have until 2032 to nominate a candidate. But it's no secret that Khamenei will have the final say on the nominee. Not so long ago, Western sources were reporting that Ebrahim Raisi, the country's president, could be tapped for the post. But Raisi died in a helicopter crash in May of 2024. Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba, has since emerged as the frontrunner. Whoever wins this contest will be the key player in determining Iran's future. He will be the de facto head of state, even though Khamenei never meets with any world leaders. And the isolated nature of the office is unlikely to change, regardless of who replaces him.
How stable is the Ayatollah's regime in Iran? What does it mean that it now has a moderate and reformist president? And finally, does the Islamic Republic pose a threat to the entire stability of the West? Iran has been shutting its doors for external observers for decades now, but our guests, nonetheless, will be able to provide us with answers to these questions. I'm pleased to say, joining me tonight are Annie Tracy Samuel, Associate Professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Michael Singh, Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Professor Arang Keshavarzian, Associate Professor at New York University. Good evening, and welcome to Wider View. And Annie, I want to begin with you straight away and ask you to provide us with a bigger picture of the institutional relationship between the Supreme Leader and the President of the Islamic Republic. So who is the Supreme Leader, and how much of a practical and direct political influence over the course of strategy in the country does he actually have?
Great. Thank you for having me. The Supreme Leader is the ultimate authority in Iran. His power exceeds that of anyone else in the system. He has either direct or indirect control of all branches of government, the military, and the media. and also importantly, effective control of an institution known as the Guardian Council. The Supreme Leader appoints half of its members, and the Guardian Council is charged both with ensuring that laws passed by the Majlis, the parliament, accord with Islamic norms and the doctrines of the system, and also with approving candidates to run for election. All major domestic and foreign policy decisions require the Supreme Leader's consent. So, as I said, his power is ultimate, but at the same time, it's not total. The Islamic Republic is a highly complex regime. It includes numerous formal institutions that often overlap with one another. And it's also highly factionalized within itself. And there are many ways for the Supreme Leader and others to exercise power informally.
So I'm going to jump on this straight away in a very quick follow-up question. What is the point of having a president then if you actually have a person that can practically override, as you're saying, anything that comes out of the office of the president?
Yes. So the president is the head of state. As you noted, the Supreme Leader has not left the country. Usually meetings with foreign leaders are taken by the president. And the role of the president comes from the fact that the Islamic Republic is an Islamic republic. It's a hybrid regime that combines a theocracy with republican elements. And the Supreme Leader is supposed to be a bit more behind the scenes to guide the system, whereas the president is the elected official head of state.
Mike, turning to you now, again, speaking of the president, we now have Masoud Pezeshkian, who was elected as the president after Ibrahim Raisi died in the plane crash. He was widely acclaimed, especially by Western media, as a moderate, as a reformist. But what does that mean that one is a reformist in the context of a country like the Islamic Republic?
Well, thanks, Mateusz. And I think that, Dr. Tracy Samuel has given you a great explanation of how the Iranian system works. And I think what's important to remember is that someone like Dr. Pezeshkian, the current president of Iran, just like his predecessor, who was thought of in the West as more radical or more hardline, is dedicated to the preservation of this system that Dr. Tracy Samuel has described. So there is a debate, I think, within the regime in Iran about how best to preserve this Islamic Republic system. Is it through isolation? Is it through sort of enforcing ideological purity inside Iran? Or is it, like, say, China in the 1970s, through allowing some measure of economic opening or even social opening in order to preserve political control and fend off reform? Dr. Pezeshkian, I think, is in that latter category, as were some other presidents who we talk about as reformist or moderate. But those labels don't really mean that they're somehow opposed to the regime or that they're somehow against the policies of the Islamic Republic that we have found so troublesome.
So speaking of that, and on that note, I'm going to move to you, Arang, and ask you about the societal part of this equation. Because the one thing that we in Europe, for obvious reasons, don't really have much exposure on is how people of Iran perceive all that political struggle that happens behind the scenes. So how popular is the regime within the Iranian society? Because we periodically hear about acts of rebellion that's usually centered around women and women's rights, at least the ones that break into the European news cycle. But is it a significant opposition level, or is it just something casual, not to say anecdotal, that doesn't really resonate with the rest of society?
Yes, you're absolutely correct that Iranian society is quite dynamic, quite engaged. In recent years, in fact, in the past couple decades, we've had regular moments in which Iranians have organized, have mobilized to protest, to make demands of the ruling establishment, this somewhat complex, diverse ruling establishment that the previous speakers have outlined for you. Now, why do Iranians take to the street? On the one hand, it's the ballot box or elections have not always been delivered on the promises that presidents and members of the parliament have claimed that they were going to achieve. So, in part, the street or street politics is a response to the shortcomings and the failures of the political establishment. But on the other hand, what's important to understand is that when Iranians take to the streets, they're making very concrete demands. You are absolutely right that some of these demands are very intimately related to the rights of women and gender equality, or the ability of women to be full citizens in society vis-a-vis the law and so forth. But we also have a very regular, oftentimes underreported protests around workers' grievances, around issues of unemployment, around questions of low pay, of work conditions of various sorts. That's another important area of foment and political dissent in Iran. And the third one I want to kind of highlight is also issues around the environment, around access to clean water, and various other sorts of resources. All of that to say that Iran society is deeply engaged. It's not silent. It's not cowed, despite the highly repressive nature of the political system itself. So it is an Islamic Republic where the Republican dimensions are institutions of the regime are continuously being challenged and have been continuously being asked to be responsive to the demands of the citizens and the citizenry.
So thank you all for these very valuable insights into the internal politics of the Islamic Republic. But it's equally important, especially from the European point of view, to try to find out and map the direction of Iran's foreign policy. So let's take a closer look at that topic right now. Over the past few decades, Tehran has created what's come to be known as the axis of resistance. It's an impressive, highly complex web of proxy groups and paramilitary scattered all over the Middle East. But recently, Iran has been making attempts to expand its influence beyond this region. What is the Ayatollah's endgame? We explore that question in our next report.
Since the summer, fears have been growing about a possible direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. The two countries are mortal enemies and refuse to recognize each other's statehood. When Iranian missiles were fired into Israel in April, American, British, and Jordanian fighters were scrambled to protect it. The Biden administration made efforts to convince Benjamin Netanyahu not to escalate further. But American influence in the Middle East is waning, increasing the likelihood of destabilization. The main agents of chaos in this region are Iran's proxies. They exist in almost every country, but vary in nature and their methods of combat. Hezbollah, the Party of God, is perhaps the most powerful among them. Considered to be the largest paramilitary organization on the planet, it also provides healthcare, religious, and educational services. But recent Israeli intelligence operations and military strikes have all but eliminated its leadership. The longtime political leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was also killed this year. In other parts of the region, Iran's axis of resistance has been more successful. The Houthis managed to disrupt shipping through the Red Sea for months. And just recently, Iran became involved on yet another front, supporting the militias fighting against rebels in Syria. It also uses criminal organizations in other countries as subcontractors for politically motivated assassinations. It's become increasingly evident that Iran isn't just acting in self-defense. It has offensive plans that stretch far beyond the Middle East.
So, Annie, I want to begin with you again, and since you were so well versed in the affairs of the entire Middle East, I wanted to ask you about the axis of resistance. We heard just in our report about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, just recently yet another very important development in Syria. Is it correct to identify all of these organizations as a defensive shield of Iran, or is it actually something of an offensive nature almost, in which, by means of which the Iranian government tries to achieve some sort of advantage in other countries?
Certainly from Iran's perspective, it's defensive. And I think even from an outsider's perspective, when we take a sober view of the situation, we don't see that Iran is overtly expansionist. It's not looking to invade other countries or launch wars. And its behavior is generally pragmatic. It has sought to avoid escalation and war. war. It's now focused on diffusing tensions. And that's in part because the survival of the regime remains the absolute priority. Hezbollah and the axis of resistance are certainly critical to Iran, and those have suffered severe blows as a result of Israel's actions in Lebanon. But I would say that Iran would continue to act pragmatically in order to ensure that it does not get itself into an all-out war with Israel or the United States that it knows it cannot win.
So quick follow-up. What about Syria? What does that mean that Iran will try to achieve a pragmatic aim in Syria in the context of that particular country, where we also have the Russians that need to be taken into consideration in part of the equation?
I think it will work closely with the Russians and with the Assad regime in order to try to ensure that the rebel advance does not go further. Iran does not want to see the fall of the Assad regime by any means, and it won't let Assad go without a fight, but it will continue to judge whether to get involved and to what extent.
That's very important in the context of the current developments in the Middle East. But on that note, there's another elephant in the room that we need to touch upon. Mike, a frank question to you. What's next for Iran with Trump 2.0? There are very few things that we can say for sure with regard to Trump's foreign policy, but we know this administration will be an administration of hawks against Iran. That's almost certain. But what does that mean in practical terms?
Well, look, I think you're right to ask the question. And of course, it is the question on everyone's minds right now. But it's also important to recognize that U.S. policy toward Iran for the last couple of decades has actually been pretty consistent when it comes down to it. And U.S. concerns about Iran have been pretty consistent. So, the Iranians may see themselves as acting defensively, but that's not how they're seen in Washington. In Washington, they're seen as essentially an imperialist state, not so different from, say, how the Soviets operating in Eastern Europe, where you have a country, Iran, that effectively through political commissars, through military officials, is controlling other countries like Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, in a way that treats those countries as not fully sovereign, and in a way that frankly threatens American interests and American partners in the region. You have that same country, Iran, pursuing what looks, for all intents and purposes, to be a nuclear weapons program, even though, of course, they deny that it's a nuclear weapons program. President Trump will come into office concerned about all of these things and wanting to address them and the threat that they pose to U.S. interests, but also, and this is critical, wanting to avoid getting involved in a war if he can, in order to address those problems. So I think we'll see all the tools of American pressure being used, diplomacy and economic sanctions, and perhaps even military pressure. But I think he'll also look to capitalize on Iran's weakness at the moment. Iran has suffered some very serious military blows, especially at the hands of Israel. Iran is under diplomatic pressure from Europe. And President Trump coming in will look to add to that pressure and produce some kind of result, likely a diplomatic result, if he can, to address the concerns that we have with Iran.
A quick follow-up question, picking up on what you said, because you said the American policy towards Tehran has been pretty consistent over the last decades. Maybe it should not have been. Do you think, kind of to try to play the devil's advocate, is there something that the White House of any administration could have done differently over the last decades, perhaps supporting a pro-democracy actor within that would have been a better outcome for both Iran and that bilateral relationship?
Well, it's a very contentious question here in Washington. And of course, Iran policy has proven quite polarizing, despite, frankly, the consistency that we have seen. So you could argue, for example, that in the early 2000s, the U.S. should have really turned its attention towards Iran rather than, say, Iraq, and eliminated Iran's nuclear program when it was much smaller using military means. Many people would say that the diplomatic deal reached in 2015 by the Obama administration with Iran essentially squandered all of the economic pressure that had been built up for a deal that just wasn't good enough. And then there are others who would say, as you said, Mateusz, that in fact, what we really should be doing is trying to pursue regime change in Iran. But of course, regime change, especially regime change imposed from without or imposed through military means, is something which is very out of fashion in Washington right now because of our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan.
But do you think there is anybody on the ground, based on your knowledge or intelligence, that could benefit from a support and could bring about the bottom-up regime change? Or is that fantasy?
My own view is that all of these Iranians who are going out into the streets, they're risking their lives in hopes of positive change in their country. They deserve our support in the West, in the United States, in Poland, in Europe, and elsewhere. However, I think they're going to be the agents of change in their country. I don't know which of them might emerge and be that figure that can lead change. All I know is that I think, to the extent we have those tools, we should be supporting them, but we shouldn't be getting in front of them or trying to substitute for them or trying to direct them, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. So we know the perspective in Washington. Now back to Middle East with you, Arang. I wanted to ask you, how do other Middle Eastern states view Iran? Because we know that on the one hand, Iran is a very big country, is a very powerful economy, but also it runs a number of destabilizing proxies for the entire region, which might not work to the advantage of people like MBS, for instance. So what do other leaders in the region think of the Islamic Republic?
Well, this is an important issue, and over the past 40 years, frankly, the reaction and attitudes of other political leaders in the region has been mixed at best, but it has also shifted quite a bit. Speaking about more recent times, while for much of the early part of the 21st century, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council have had very tense relations, partly due to the fallout of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the occupation and the rise of various pro-Iranian factions and forces in Iraq. This led to a lot of tensions between UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, this became connected and interconnected with the Arab uprisings and especially the protest movement and ultimately the civil war in Yemen. This really brought Iran and Saudi Arabia in complete loggerheads in the Arabian Peninsula itself, where Iran allied itself with the Houthis. And Saudi Arabia, of course, was directly involved in the Yemeni civil war. What we've seen, however, in the past 18 months, past 2 years, is a dramatic shift in which, thanks in large part to the Iraqi government as well as the Chinese, there has been a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a warming of relations. That has played an important role in de-escalating tensions in the wider Middle East this past year. So in the context of Israel's war on Gaza, we should be thankful that, in fact, Iran and Saudi Arabia had a working relationship. I've even had sending diplomats to each other's capitals. This has been an important development, which I think the whole world should support. Whether it's the United States or other governments in the Middle East region. Now,
a very complex web of interdependence, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Iran, for all intents and purposes, is quite unlikely to back down, which also means that we will have to be keeping an eye on this country also in wider view. Mike Singh, Annie Tracy Samuel, and Professor Arang Keshavarzian were our guests tonight. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Despite suffering heavy sanctions and a status as a pariah state, Iran has managed to maintain a strong position in international affairs. But the country is shaking from within and could experience turbulence in the near future. Whether they will result in any significant reforms, that remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Iran is a much bigger deal right now than many in Europe seem to think. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will try to measure the political pulse of Romania as the country finishes its marathon of presidential and parliamentary elections. Make sure you're with us next Thursday, and have a good evening.